Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's devotional. Our thought today is going to come from 1 Samuel chapter 17. We have Goliath, who is basically mocking the armies of God. He comes out in verse 8. He says, "Am I not a Philistine, and you the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me." And he says, "I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together." And when Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. Now, David is the youngest of 8 sons. Now, the 3 oldest have gone to battle at this battle. David is tending sheep for his father. His father sends him on an errand to send some bread and some cheese to his to his 3 brothers. And so we get down into verse 20. And so for 40 days, the Goliath goes out and basically taunts Israel. And 40 days, they refuse to send anybody out to defeat or to fight Goliath. So in verse 20, David rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and took the things and went as Jesse had commanded him. Jesse's his father. He came to the camp as the army was going out to the fight and shouting for the battle. For Israel and the Philistines had drawn up in battle array, army against army. David left his supplies in the hand of the supply keeper and ran to the army and came and greeted his brothers. And so he's talking to the brothers. Here comes Goliath, and just as he had done all the other times, he says, "I defy the armies of Israel, and basically you guys are a bunch of cowards. You need to come choose somebody to fight me." And all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him and were dreadfully afraid. And they talk about how surely, can you imagine what the king would give us if one of us were to defeat this man, but who's going to do it? And verse 26, David spoke to the men who stood by him and saying, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Now it's interesting, in no point in the chapter are the armies of Israel ever referred to as the armies of the living God, except by David. David's the only one who ever talks about Jehovah at any point here in chapter 26. And then, so his oldest brother gets upset at him, and the rest of the brothers get upset at him as well, because David's kind of sticking his nose in where it doesn't belong. And verse 32. So ultimately, these words which David spoke, David's kind of, he's pretty adamant against Goliath. And the words of David end up hitting to Saul. And so Saul sends for David, and David says to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." So, again, we don't know how old David was exactly, but he can't be much older than a teenager. Okay, he can't be probably more than maybe 15, 16-ish. I would think that'd probably be on the top end. So this is for most of these older fellas looking at David, a lot of these guys are probably thinking he's an upstart, nosy, arrogant little kid who thinks he can do all this stuff. And for a lot of those older fellows, that their perception of that. But what's interesting here is listen to what David says. So Saul, here in verse 33, Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are a youth, and he is a man of war from his youth." So keep in mind, earlier in chapter 17, it's described for us exactly how big Goliath was. I mean, dude is huge. He's 9 foot, 9 inches tall, something like that. And his armor, just his chest plate, weighs something like 250 to 300 pounds. I mean, the guy is huge. His staff, the tip of his staff weighs something like 50 pounds. And just crazy numbers that we're talking about in terms of his how imposing this guy is. And then add to the fact that this guy is very experienced. Okay, so he's not just tall and like he's lanky and doesn't know what he's doing. This guy's tall. I'm sure he's very muscular and he's very experienced in war. But David said to Saul, "Your servant used to keep his father's sheep. And when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went after it and struck it, and delivered the lamb from its mouth. And when it arose against me, I caught it by its beard, and struck and killed it." And then he says, "Your servant has killed both bear, or lion and bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, seeing he has defied the armies of the living God." Now, we're not given the accounts of when this specifically happened, but I don't believe that David is in any way lying or making stuff up or exaggerating. Being a shepherd was not an easy or safe task at this point in time. So I'm not at all surprised that David probably had to deal with lions or bears attacking his sheep. But he mentions the fact that I would go after it and I would strike it. He says, "When it arose against me, I caught it by its beard and struck and killed it." David wasn't taking any of it. Okay, no lion and no bear is going to steal any lamb from me or from my father. It's his father's lambs. But then when he says in verse 36, "Yeah, I've killed lions, I've killed bears. This uncircumcised Philistine is going to be no different." And notice once again he uses this phrase, "because he's defied the armies of the living God." Again, from an older man perspective, and maybe even from Saul's perspective, what an arrogant young whippersnapper! You know, he's so full of himself, thinking that even if, okay, and I fully believe that David did, but coming from Saul's perspective, even if you have killed a lion or a bear, even if you did kill these things, which, to be fair, is a pretty formidable and impressive feat, this is not like a lion or a bear. I mean, this is a man who's almost 10 feet tall, who is well armed and well skilled in his craft. But then David goes on to say, "Moreover, David said, the Lord, who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." Just listen to the absolute conviction that David has. He's not afraid one bit of Goliath. Now think about this for a second, okay? Even the tallest of the army of Israel. Remember, we were told that regarding Saul, he looked like a king. He stood head and shoulders above all of the others, and so he looked like a leader. He was somebody everyone could point out in a crowd. But even Saul was probably no taller than maybe 6 foot. Okay, pushing any further than 6 foot, 6'2" or 3" is probably being way too generous. David, being a young fella, again, we're even suggesting that maybe he's 15, 16 here. That's on the very high end. David might be 5 foot tall at this point. Maybe, okay, maybe 5'2" or 3. Goliath is almost twice David's height, and certainly probably several times his size, in terms of width and so forth, and physical strength, probably. And so here's David, who doesn't bat an eye. He says that God delivered me. Notice it wasn't David taking credit for having killed the lion and the bear as if it was my strength and it was something that I did, and that's how impressive a fighter I am, or how smart I am to have slayed these wild animals. He gives credit to Jehovah, that the Lord delivered me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear, and the Lord's going to deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. There is no hesitation on David's part. There's no doubt in his mind. But what's driving David is the fact that this Philistine is defying the armies, not just of Israel, but the armies of the living God. That's what's upsetting David. And so Saul says to David, "Go, and the Lord be with you." We're not told specifically if Saul believes that David can actually accomplish this. I tend to think Saul is just humoring David. Sure. All right. You think you can go kill that Philistine? You go for it, young man. You go out there and you show that Philistine what for, right? I don't know that Saul was convinced that David would actually be able to accomplish this. But David has been the only one in chapter 17, up to verse 37, who has mentioned Jehovah. Saul mentions Jehovah only because David has. Because David talks about the armies of the living God. The fact that God delivered me from the hand of the lion and the bear. God's going to deliver me from this Philistine. And the fact that this uncircumcised Philistine will be just like the lion and the bear. So Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with a coat of mail. It's interesting that David, or that Saul, is willing to do this. Maybe, again, whether or not Saul thought David would be successful, I tend to think probably not. But the fact that he's at least willing to give David all the armor, give him the best chance he has. Hey, you want to go out there? That's great. I'm gonna give you the best chance that you have. And in verse 39, David fastened his sword to his armor and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. And David said to Saul, "I cannot walk with these, for I have not tested them." So David took them off. This term "test," it's not just he tried walking with them, and well, isn't that kind of testing them? It's being skilled in moving with them. Now keep in mind, David he's not a built guy. He's not certainly in any way experienced wearing armor. And that's what David's referring to. I can't move in this. The fact that it was probably way too heavy for David, the fact that it was probably way too big for him as well, the fact that David's hadn't developed the muscles yet probably to carry that kind of armor. And so David took off the armor. And in verse 40, did that sway David? Did that, maybe this isn't such a great idea? No. It says he took his staff in his hand. He chose for himself 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in a shepherd's bag, in a pouch which he had, and his sling was in his hand, and he drew near to the Philistine. David goes back to his roots. He takes his staff, he takes some stones, he has a sling in his hand, which certainly this is something he would probably be experienced with as being a shepherd, because that's probably going to scare off, especially if you hit a couple of wolves with some stones. It's probably going to scare some wolves off for sure. Lions and bears, maybe not, which is why David had to actually slay him with his hand. But he was probably pretty experienced with a sling. So here comes Goliath, verse 41. The Philistine came and began drawing near to David, and the man who bore the shield went before him. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was only a youth, ruddy and good-looking. And so the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And remember, David's got his staff in his hand. And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. So the Philistine calls on the gods of the Philistines and curses David by these false gods, as if that is going to do anything. But in verse 44, the Philistine said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." So you could see the Philistine, the arrogance, and probably well earned in the sense of the confidence, certainly. But there's a bit of arrogance there as well. The fact that nobody has probably ever been able to stand up to him, or stand toe-to-toe for sure, to this fella. And here's itty-bitty David, who is coming without armor, without a sword even. He comes with a staff and some rocks, which Goliath may not even be able to see at this point. But he says, "Come on, I'm going to feed you to the birds and the beasts." So in verse 45, David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." Remember, every time that David would go out for 40 days, or Goliath would go out for 40 days, he would yell and he would taunt the armies of Israel. And he would say, "I defy the armies of Israel. You're a bunch of cowards. You won't face me," and so forth. So when David goes to this Philistine, "Yeah, I see your sword, I see your spear, and I see your javelin. But I've got someone greater. I've got something better than what you've got. I have the Lord of hosts. I have the God, the Jehovah of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." And I don't believe that David's saying that you've defied the armies of Israel. That's what Goliath is saying. I believe that David's saying you've defied Jehovah. Not the armies of Israel. You've defied Jehovah, who is the God of the armies of Israel. "This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel." Again, looking at this from a kind of older man perspective, what a head this fella has on him. Okay, this young man, he is really, from a human perspective, talk about arrogance. But I suggest this has nothing to do with arrogance. Again, arrogance tends to be more about, look at me, look at my ability, look at my power, look how good I am. And not once has David referenced his own abilities, his own talent. Instead, it's, "God delivered the lion and the bear to me. God will deliver this Philistine to me. God is the one who I come to you to fight. God's the one I wield. This day, God will deliver you into my hand." And just the absolute conviction, the strength of faith that David has is, especially again remembering he's a young guy, young fella. "Then all this assembly," verse 47, "shall know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." You put all your trust, Goliath, into your sword and your spear and your armor and your javelin, but the battle belongs to the Lord. And all of the armies, both Israel's and the Philistines, they will know that the Lord does not save with sword and spear. It's not about who's strongest. It's not about who's the fastest. It's not about who's the most skilled. It's about who has the faith, who has the strength of conviction to trust in the living God. Verse 48, "So it was when the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David. David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine." Notice David hurried. It sounds like it even says David hurried and ran. I mean, it's not like David's trudging along or kind of just walking softly. He's gunning it. "And David put his hand," verse 49, "in his bag and took out a stone. He slung it and struck the Philistine in his forehead, so that the stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in the hand of David." Now, I think it's interesting that David, he didn't even need 5. It doesn't sound like he picked 5 smooth stones, but he didn't even need 5. He only needed 1. And David hit exactly, apparently, where he was aiming. Okay, and again, I not to say, yeah, I think David had skill with the sling here, but his trust, his conviction was in Jehovah, that Jehovah would guide him, that Jehovah would give him the victory. And so he killed him. I mean, it sank into his forehead. Obviously, that's a pretty lethal blow there. He struck the Philistine and killed him, but there wasn't any sword in the hand of David. Therefore David ran and stood over the Philistine. He took his sword, drew it out of its sheath. Now, can you imagine? Here's this little boy picking up this, what must have been a huge sword of Goliath. In fact, the sword of Goliath ends up making another appearance later in the life of David. But he took Goliath's sword, drew it out of its sheath, and killed him and cut off his head with it. And when the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Now, some people want to ask, well, did he kill him with the rock, or did he kill him when he cut off his head? At the very least, the Philistine had, I believe it was a lethal blow from the stone itself. He may have still been breathing a little bit, as he says he killed him and cut off his head with it. But regardless of how you look at it, David took him down by God's help. Now, notice they fled, the Philistines did, after they saw their champion destroyed. Now the men of Israel and Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as the entrance of the valley to the gates of Ekron. And the wounded of the Philistines fell along the road to Shaaraim, even as far as Gath and Ekron. And the children of Israel returned from chasing the Philistines, and they plundered their tents. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent. And when Saul saw David going out against the Philistine, he said to Abner, the commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this youth? Abner said, As your soul lives, O king, I do not know. And so Saul looks into it, finds out that it's David. And then there's kind of that relationship that takes place there, the kind of that friendship, or at least what starts out as a friendship between Saul and David. But what's interesting to me is also the fact that, remember what David says? He says, the Lord will deliver you into my hand. This day I will give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air. He doesn't say, I will give your carcass to the birds of the air. He says, I'll give the carcasses of the camp of the Philistines. David, whether David knew in advance or kind of believed that if he killed Goliath, that's what was going to happen, that the Philistines would just up and run away, and all that Israel and Judah had to do was just chase them down and slaughter them. I don't know. But David had an understanding that it wasn't just Goliath who was going to die that day. It was the Philistines. God was going to give Israel, Judah, the victory over the Philistines, and it was going to be their carcasses that was going to feed the birds of the air and the beasts of the earth, not David's body. And ultimately, verse 47 is exactly what happens. But it's one act of faith, one act of complete trust and conviction in Jehovah that kind of presents this victory. It's really the Saul and the armies of Israel didn't really have to do anything. David single-handedly, again, by the power of Jehovah, single-handedly gave victory to Israel. Because by killing Goliath, scaring the Philistines, they flee, and all they have to do is chase them down and kill them. It just goes to show, the whole point of this devotional is to see the complete faith and conviction that David had, and why God refers to David as a man after his own heart. And we've talked before, how can we be people after God's own heart, just like David was? Well, for one thing, David always sought to please God. Doesn't mean David was perfect. It doesn't mean David didn't make mistakes in his life. We know he did. But David sought to please God in all the things that he did. And David allowed that term godliness, that's the desire to please God. It gave that conviction substance. His trust in Jehovah, his complete and utter conviction in Jehovah and the power of Jehovah, all kind of meshed with this godliness. I want to do what God wants me to do. I want to please Jehovah. Well, why am I willing to have such a complete submission to God? Because I trust Him. Because I am completely persuaded and convicted He's worthy of that submission. And so it's as if David's complete confidence in Jehovah fed his desire to please Him. And his desire to please Him fed his conviction. And this is why, even in the New Testament, we see how that faith and conviction, godliness, the desire to do that which is right, righteousness, which is the acknowledgement and submission to God's standard of right and wrong, these characteristics mesh together, and they kind of uplift each other. They kind of grow with one another. And what a great example of David's godliness, David's faith, his desire to do what's right in the sight of God, how it all comes together in what by some would read as extremely arrogant, kind of full of himself, young whippersnapper, but in reality was faith and wisdom beyond his years, to acknowledge and recognize that if God is for us, who can be against us? And he completely lived his life by that motto: if God is for me, who can be against me? All right, that's the devotional for you today. Lord willing, our next devotional will be on Thursday. Hope to see you all then. Thank you, everybody.